The clock read 11:47 p.m. when 8-year-old Michael Carter stopped breathing. In the sprawling estate where every door handle cost more than most people's monthly rent, where security cameras monitored every corner and staff moved like ghosts through marble hallways, panic erupted in a way money couldn't fix. Michael's father, tech billionaire Richard Carter, stood frozen in the doorway of his son's bedroom, his phone halfway to his ear, the number for their private physician still undialed. His wife Eleanor screamed for help, her voice echoing through rooms filled with priceless art that suddenly meant nothing. The boy's lips were turning blue. His small chest had stopped moving. And in those seconds that felt like hours, every person in that house understood a truth that wealth often obscures: when death comes knocking, it doesn't care about your bank account. But what happened next would unravel secrets that had been carefully buried for over 2 decades. Because the person who saved Michael's life that night wasn't supposed to be there at all. And when the truth about who she really was came to light, it would destroy the very foundation this family had built their empire on. This isn't just a story about a rescue. It's about what happens when the people we ignore become the people we can't forget. Let me take you back to the beginning, 6 months before that terrifying night. The Carter household ran like clockwork, a well-oiled machine of privilege and precision. Richard Carter had built his fortune in artificial intelligence software, creating programs that predicted market trends with unsettling accuracy. His company, Carter Analytics, employed over 3,000 people across 7 countries, and his personal wealth had recently crossed the $5 billion mark. He was the kind of man who appeared on magazine covers with headlines like America's Tech Visionary and the Mind Behind Tomorrow's Markets. His wife Eleanor came from old money, the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted, that valued discretion above all else. Their son Michael was their only child, born after years of fertility treatments and what Eleanor referred to in rare vulnerable moments as our miracle. The boy had always been fragile, prone to respiratory infections and allergic reactions that required constant vigilance. He attended private school with children of diplomats and entertainment moguls, where tuition cost more than most colleges and security clearances were mandatory for all staff. The Carters employed a household staff of 12 people, from their head housekeeper Margaret to their personal chef Eduardo, from their chauffeur James to their security detail that rotated in 8-hour shifts. These people moved through the mansion like shadows, seen but not truly noticed, performing their duties with the kind of invisible efficiency that wealth demands. And then there was Sarah Mitchell. She arrived at the Carter estate on a Tuesday morning in late March, sent by the staffing agency that the Carters had used for over a decade. The previous maid had quit abruptly, something about a family emergency back in Poland that required her immediate return. Sarah was meant to be temporary, a fill-in until they found someone permanent, someone who fit the exact specifications that Eleanor Carter had outlined in painful detail to the agency director. She needed to be quiet, discreet, experienced with luxury homes, comfortable with strict household rules, and willing to work irregular hours when the Carters entertained their high-profile guests. Sarah Mitchell checked all those boxes on paper. She was 42 years old, with references from 3 previous positions in upscale neighborhoods. Her resume listed skills in deep cleaning, laundry care for delicate fabrics, and experience with homes that had extensive art collections. She spoke softly, made eye contact only when addressed directly, and had a way of moving through rooms that made her almost invisible. Eleanor approved her hiring after a 15-minute interview where Sarah said exactly 7 words, "Yes ma'am, I understand, and thank you." What Eleanor didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every single word on Sarah's resume was carefully constructed to hide who she really was. The references were real but belonged to another person entirely. The name Sarah Mitchell was real but not the one she'd been born with. And her reason for seeking employment in this specific household had nothing to do with needing work and everything to do with a promise she'd made to herself 9 years earlier while sitting in a hospital room, watching a life slip away that she'd been powerless to save. Sarah's first week in the Carter household was spent learning the routines that governed every aspect of their lives. She learned that Mr. Carter's morning coffee had to be ready by 6:15 a.m. exactly, French press with beans ground that morning, served in the study while he reviewed Asian market reports. She learned that Mrs. Carter never ate breakfast, only drank green juice made from a specific recipe that the chef prepared fresh each morning. She learned that Michael's room had to be cleaned by 10 a.m. on weekdays while he was at school, that his sheets were changed every other day because of his allergies, and that certain cleaning products were absolutely forbidden because they triggered his asthma. She learned the hidden rhythms of wealth, the 1,000 small details that separated a house from a home for people who measured their time in multiples of their income. But Sarah was also learning things the Carters didn't realize they were teaching her. She noticed how Michael would sometimes struggle to catch his breath after running in from the garden, how he'd press his hand to his chest in a way that suggested discomfort he'd learned not to complain about. She noticed the multiple EpiPens stored in various locations throughout the house, the inhaler that Michael kept in his backpack, the medical alert bracelet he wore that listed allergies to tree nuts, shellfish, and certain antibiotics. She noticed these things because she'd been trained to notice them, trained in a life she'd left behind, trained in skills that had nothing to do with dusting furniture or folding fitted sheets. And she noticed something else too. In the study, on the shelf behind Richard Carter's desk, there was a photograph from 15 years ago. A younger Richard and Eleanor at some charity gala, smiling for the camera, dressed in formal wear that probably cost more than a car. But it wasn't them Sarah stared at during those brief moments when she was alone in that room, carefully dusting around priceless first editions and technology awards. It was the building visible in the background of that photo, a building she recognized because she'd spent 3 years of her life walking through its corridors. Harbor View Medical Center. The same hospital where everything had changed. 3 months into her employment, Sarah had become exactly what the Carters wanted her to be: invisible, efficient, unremarkable. She cleaned their home, did their laundry, restocked their supplies, and existed in their peripheral vision as nothing more than a person who performed tasks. Margaret, the head housekeeper, had warmed to her slightly, appreciating that Sarah never needed instructions repeated and didn't engage in the kind of gossip that sometimes circulated among the staff. Eduardo, the chef, liked that she stayed out of his kitchen during meal preparation and always cleaned her few dishes immediately. Even Eleanor, who rarely acknowledged the help beyond giving instructions, had mentioned to Richard that this new girl seemed adequate, which for Eleanor was practically glowing praise. But there were moments when Sarah's careful facade almost cracked. Like the time Michael had a minor allergic reaction to something in his school lunch, and Sarah had been the one who found him in the bathroom, struggling to breathe, his inhaler fumbling from his shaking hands. She'd taken it from him, checked the dosage, tilted his head at the proper angle, and talked him through his breathing with a calm authority that came from years of training. "You're okay," she'd said. "I need you to breathe with me. In through your nose, count to 4. Hold it. Now out through your mouth, count to 6. That's it. You're doing great." When Margaret arrived 30 seconds later, alerted by another staff member, she found Michael breathing normally and Sarah kneeling beside him with a hand on his shoulder. "What happened?" Margaret had demanded, her face pale with worry. Michael explained about the reaction, about how Sarah had helped him with his inhaler. Margaret had thanked her briskly, then taken Michael to his mother, who immediately called their pediatrician and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. No one questioned how a maid knew exactly how to handle a medical emergency. No one asked where she'd learned to stay that calm under pressure. They simply filed it away as fortunate that someone had been there, and life in the Carter household returned to its carefully orchestrated normal. But Sarah couldn't forget that moment. She couldn't forget the feeling of that inhaler in her hand, the familiar weight of medical intervention, the muscle memory of crisis response that she'd thought she'd left behind. That night, alone in the small bedroom she'd been given in the staff quarters, she sat on her bed and stared at her hands. These hands had once held a scalpel, had once sutured wounds, had once performed procedures that saved lives. These hands had once worn surgical gloves instead of cleaning gloves, had once been steady and confident and skilled. These hands had also failed. Failed to save someone who mattered more than anything in the world. Failed to notice warning signs until it was too late. Failed to be there when it counted most. Sarah opened the bottom drawer of her small dresser and pulled out a folder she kept hidden beneath her spare uniforms. Inside were newspaper clippings, printed articles, documents she'd collected over the years. Photos of Richard Carter at various events, his company's IPO announcement, his appearance before a congressional committee about AI ethics. And beneath all of that, a death certificate. Connor Mitchell. Age 26. Cause of death, acute respiratory failure secondary to anaphylaxis. Date, 9 years, 4 months, and 17 days ago. Sarah traced her finger over the name, remembering. Connor had been everything to her. Her younger brother, her responsibility after their parents died in a car accident when she was 19 and he was 12. She'd raised him while putting herself through medical school, had celebrated when he got into college, had been so proud when he landed an internship at Carter Analytics in their data science division. He'd been brilliant with numbers, could see patterns in chaos the way some people could hear music in noise. Richard Carter had personally recruited him after his internship, had promised him opportunities, had assured Sarah when she'd expressed concerns about Connor's health, his allergies, his asthma, that their company had excellent health care and that her brother would be well taken care of. Connor had died at a company retreat. A team-building weekend at a resort in the mountains, where Carter Analytics had gathered their top performers for 3 days of workshops and networking. The official report said it was a tragic accident. A mix-up in the kitchen. Connor had specifically noted his tree nut allergy on his dietary restrictions form, but somehow his salad had been dressed with walnut oil. He'd gone into anaphylactic shock. His EpiPen had malfunctioned. The resort's medical staff had been overwhelmed. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Richard Carter had sent flowers to the funeral. An enormous arrangement that must have cost thousands of dollars. He'd sent a personal note expressing his deepest condolences and his shock at this terrible accident. He'd established a scholarship fund in Connor's name at their alma mater, a generous gesture that the university had publicly acknowledged. He'd done everything right, everything that a caring CEO should do when tragedy strikes one of his employees. But he'd never acknowledged the other part of the story, the part that Sarah had discovered only after months of digging through records, talking to other people who'd been at that retreat, piecing together what really happened. Connor had complained about feeling unwell that morning. He'd told his supervisor that he thought he might be having a reaction to something. The supervisor had told him to tough it out, that he couldn't skip the scheduled activities, that important presentations were happening that afternoon and Carter himself would be disappointed if Connor wasn't there. Connor had asked for permission to go to the hospital, just to be safe. The supervisor had said no. And when Connor had finally collapsed, when it became clear that this was a medical emergency, there had been a delay. A full 18 minutes before anyone called for an ambulance. 18 minutes because the company didn't want to disrupt the retreat, didn't want to cause alarm, didn't want Richard Carter's important weekend to be derailed by what they hoped was just an employee being dramatic. By the time they realized Connor was dying, it was too late. The company had settled with Sarah quietly, a substantial sum that came with a non-disclosure agreement she'd been pressured to sign while still in shock from grief. They'd made the whole thing disappear. Scrubbed it from their records. Ensured that when people looked up Connor Mitchell, they'd find only the sanitized version: tragic accident, company sympathetic response, scholarship fund established. No mention of negligence. No mention of a supervisor who'd been quietly transferred to another division. No mention of the 18 minutes that could have saved a life. Sarah had signed that agreement because she'd been drowning in grief, because her brother's medical bills had been crushing, because she'd still been in the middle of her medical residency and couldn't afford to fight a billion-dollar company in court. She'd taken their money, signed their papers, and tried to move forward. But moving forward turned out to be impossible. Every time she walked into the hospital where she was completing her residency in emergency medicine, every time she saw a patient with an allergic reaction, every time someone's EpiPen saved their life, she thought about Connor. She thought about those 18 minutes. She thought about a system that valued convenience and reputation over a human life. And eventually, she couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't keep showing up, couldn't keep pretending she was okay, couldn't keep performing medicine when she'd failed so completely to protect the one person who'd mattered most. She'd walked away from her residency 3 years ago, with just months left before she would have been a fully licensed emergency medicine physician. She'd walked away from everything she'd worked for, everything Connor had been so proud of her for achieving. She'd disappeared into a series of temporary jobs, moving from city to city, until finally she'd ended up here, in this specific household, with this specific family. Because she'd made herself a promise. She wouldn't hurt them. She wouldn't seek revenge. She wouldn't do anything that could be traced back to her anger and her grief. But she would know them. She would understand them. She would see behind the carefully constructed image of Richard Carter, tech visionary, and see the man who'd built his empire on the backs of people like Connor, people whose lives were considered acceptable losses in the pursuit of success. That's all she'd wanted. To know. To understand. To witness the real Richard Carter, the one who existed behind closed doors. And then maybe she could finally let her brother rest. Maybe she could finally forgive herself for signing that agreement instead of fighting. Maybe she could finally move forward. But she'd never expected to care about Michael. That hadn't been part of her plan. The plan had been simple: get hired, observe, understand, and eventually leave once she'd seen enough to satisfy the angry, grieving part of herself that needed to know if Richard Carter ever thought about the people he'd failed. She hadn't planned on watching an 8-year-old boy who loved dinosaurs and struggled with reading but tried so hard to make his parents proud. She hadn't planned on seeing the way he'd light up when his father actually spent time with him instead of being on phone calls. She hadn't planned on noticing how lonely he was, how the other children at his exclusive school kept their distance because Michael was different, was fragile, was the kid who couldn't play sports or go to birthday parties where there might be nuts in the cake. She hadn't planned on starting to love him. But here she was. 6 months into her employment, and she found herself checking on Michael's breathing in a way that had nothing to do with her past and everything to do with genuinely worrying about this small, sweet kid who deserved better than parents who were too busy building empires to notice he was struggling. Here she was, folding his laundry and remembering how Connor used to leave his clothes in a pile by his bed, how she'd nagged him about it, how she'd give anything to pick up after him one more time. Here she was, dusting the photo frames in Michael's room, photos of him at various ages, always looking slightly uncomfortable, always seeming smaller and more fragile than he should, and thinking about all the photos she'd never get to take of Connor. Weddings. Children. Grandchildren. All erased by 18 minutes of negligence. And that's where she was, emotionally compromised and caught between her grief and an unexpected affection for this child, when everything changed on that October night that would expose all her secrets and force her to finally confront who she really was. Before we continue with what happened that night, let me pause here because I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments because I genuinely love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you're new to this channel, if this is your first time hearing these real-life stories that are stranger and more powerful than any fiction, click that subscribe button right now. My mom said I can't hit 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Let's prove her wrong together. Subscribe, and let's keep sharing these stories that need to be told. Now, back to that October night that changed everything. It started like any other evening in the Carter household. Richard had been in back-to-back video conferences with investors in Singapore and London, his study door closed, his assistant fielding calls and managing his calendar with military precision. Eleanor had attended a charity luncheon, then spent the afternoon at the spa, her standing Thursday appointment for a massage and facial that she never missed. Michael had come home from school, completed his homework with his tutor, practiced piano for 30 minutes under the strict eye of his music instructor, and then finally, blessedly, had been allowed to retreat to his room to read. Sarah had spent the day deep cleaning the third-floor guest suites that hadn't been used in months but had to remain pristine just in case. She'd scrubbed bathrooms, changed linens, dusted ceiling fans, and vacuumed carpets that showed no footprints but couldn't be allowed to gather any microscopic particles of dust. It was mindless work that left her body tired and her mind free to wander, to remember, to grieve. By the time evening came, she was ready to retreat to her small room, to eat the simple dinner Eduardo had left for the staff, to shower away the scent of cleaning products and fall into her narrow bed. But around 10:30 p.m., Margaret had knocked on her door with an unusual request. Michael had been sick earlier, some kind of stomach upset that had left him miserable and exhausted. Mrs. Carter had requested that someone check on him throughout the night, and Margaret was asking if Sarah would take the late-night check since she'd been so good with Michael before. Sarah had agreed, of course. Had set her phone alarm for every 2 hours, determined to make sure the boy was comfortable and safe. The first check at midnight had been unremarkable. Michael was sleeping soundly, his breathing even if a bit congested, his room at the perfect temperature that his mother insisted upon. Sarah had stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him sleep, thinking about how peaceful he looked when he wasn't trying to live up to impossible expectations. The second check at 2 a.m. was when everything went wrong. Sarah opened Michael's door quietly, expecting to find him still sleeping. Instead, she found him sitting up in bed, his hand pressed to his throat, his eyes wide with panic. He was trying to breathe, but the sound coming from his throat was a horrible, high-pitched wheeze that Sarah recognized instantly. She was across the room in seconds, her training overriding every instinct to call for help first. "Michael," she said, her voice calm and firm. "Look at me. I need you to nod if you can understand me." Michael's eyes found hers, terrified but focused. He nodded, still struggling to breathe, his lips already showing that terrifying blue tinge that meant oxygen deprivation. "Do you have your EpiPen?" Sarah asked, already looking around the room, remembering the emergency protocols she'd learned years ago. "Where is it?" Michael pointed with a shaking hand toward his desk, where his school backpack hung on the back of his chair. Sarah grabbed it, dumped the contents on the floor with no care for the textbooks and notebooks that scattered everywhere. There, the familiar orange case. She grabbed it, flipped it open, and felt her heart drop. Empty. The EpiPen was gone. Michael must have used his last one at some point and it hadn't been replaced. Somewhere in the chain of responsibility, between his parents and the school nurse and their family physician, someone had failed to notice that this child's literal life-saving medication wasn't where it should be. "Where are the others?" Sarah demanded, fighting to keep her voice calm. "Michael, there are more in the house." "Where?" But Michael was fading, his struggles to breathe becoming weaker, his eyes starting to roll back. Sarah felt time slow down in that horrible way it does during medical emergencies. She'd felt this before. Had felt this exact sensation in the moments before Connor died, when she'd been in a different hospital, working a different shift, completely unaware that her brother was fighting for his life at a company retreat in the mountains. Had felt this sense of time becoming viscous and slow while simultaneously racing forward too fast to stop. No. Not again. Not this child. Not while she stood here with skills she'd spent years learning, with knowledge she'd walked away from but that had never really left her. Sarah scooped Michael into her arms, feeling how light he was, how fragile. She ran toward the door, her mind already moving through the steps she'd need to take. The main house had EpiPens. She'd seen them. One in the kitchen, one in Eleanor's bathroom, one in the study. The study was closest, just down the hall and around the corner. She ran, her bare feet silent on the marble floors, Michael's weight almost nothing in her arms, his breathing now a barely audible rasp. "Help!" She screamed, her voice echoing through the mansion. "Someone help me!" Margaret's door flew open, the head housekeeper stumbling out in her nightgown, her face pale with shock. "What's happening?" "Call 911. Sarah shouted, not slowing down. "Anaphylaxis. Tell them we need an ambulance immediately. Tell them the patient is an 8-year-old male, severe allergic reaction, airway compromised. Tell them we're starting treatment but he needs transport right now." Margaret stood frozen for a critical second, her mind clearly struggling to process the scene, their quiet maid running through the hallways holding Michael Carter, issuing orders like an emergency room physician. "Margaret, now!" Sarah's voice cracked like a whip, and Margaret moved, fumbling for her phone. Sarah reached the study, kicked the door open with her foot, and laid Michael on the leather couch. The EpiPen was supposed to be in the desk drawer. She yanked it open, found nothing but papers and pens. "Think," she commanded herself. "Where else?" She scanned the room, her medical training organizing her panic into actionable steps. Check patient. Check airway. Michael's lips were fully blue now, his chest barely moving. She had maybe 2 minutes before brain damage, maybe 4 before death. She tilted his head back, checked his airway, saw it was swelling but not completely closed. She could intubate him if she had the equipment. She didn't have the equipment. She had her hands and whatever she could find in this mansion of useless expensive things. The EpiPen. Focus. Where would Eleanor Carter keep emergency medication? Not where it was supposed to be. Where would a woman like Eleanor, organized and controlling, actually keep something she might need quickly? The bathroom. Sarah ran to the powder room adjacent to the study, yanked open the medicine cabinet. There. 2 EpiPens, neatly arranged next to Eleanor's prescription anxiety medication and her sleeping pills. Sarah grabbed one, checked the expiration date even though she had no time, saw it was still good, and ran back to Michael. She uncapped the device, positioned it against his outer thigh, and jabbed it hard, holding it in place for the required 3 seconds. "Come on," she whispered, watching his face, counting in her head. EpiPens didn't always work immediately. Sometimes patients needed a second dose. Sometimes they needed more intervention than a single injection could provide. "But please, please let it work." Michael gasped, a huge, whooping breath that sounded horrible but was the most beautiful thing Sarah had heard in years. His eyes flew open, confused and terrified. Another gasp, this one stronger. Sarah grabbed his hand, her other hand on his chest, feeling his heart rate, monitoring his breathing, her training making her count and assess and evaluate even while relief flooded through her system. "You're okay," she said, her voice shaking now that the immediate crisis was passing. "You're going to be okay. The ambulance is coming. Just keep breathing. That's it. Good. You're doing so good, Michael." By the time Richard and Eleanor Carter burst into the study, their faces masks of terror, Michael was breathing on his own, his color slowly returning to normal, his hand gripping Sarah's like she was the only solid thing in a world that had just tilted on its axis. By the time the paramedics arrived 6 minutes later, Sarah had taken his vital signs using nothing but her fingers and her watch, and her years of medical training had monitored his response to the epinephrine, had kept him calm and stable and alive. And by the time they loaded Michael onto the stretcher and prepared to transport him to Harbor View Medical Center for observation, Sarah realized she'd just revealed exactly who she was. Because no maid knows how to handle anaphylaxis with that kind of precision. No maid knows proper medical terminology or how to give a clear, concise patient history to paramedics. No maid remains that calm under pressure unless they've been trained to handle emergencies as a matter of professional routine. She'd blown her cover completely. And as Eleanor Carter turned to her with tears streaming down her face, as Richard Carter stared at her with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read, she realized she was about to face the consequences of every choice she'd made in the past 6 months. The ambulance doors closed, taking Michael and his parents to the hospital. Sarah stood in the driveway, still in her nightclothes, still barefoot, with Margaret beside her looking equally disheveled and equally shocked. The other staff had gathered, drawn by the commotion, all of them staring at Sarah with expressions that ranged from confusion to suspicion. "Who are you?" Margaret asked quietly, and Sarah knew the question wasn't about her name. Sarah Mitchell wasn't a real person. Sarah Mitchell was a carefully constructed identity built on borrowed references and forged documents. Sarah Mitchell was what Dr. Sarah Connor had become when she'd walked away from medicine and tried to disappear into a life where she wouldn't have to think about failure and loss and the 18 minutes that had killed her brother. "I'm the person who just saved that boy's life," Sarah said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "And tomorrow, I'm probably going to be fired." She turned and walked back into the mansion, back to her small room, and sat on her bed in the dark, waiting for whatever came next. She didn't have to wait long. At 6:45 a.m., her phone rang. An unknown number. She answered it, her hand steady even though her heart was racing. "Miss Mitchell?" A woman's voice, professional and neutral. "This is Amanda Prescott, head of HR for Carter Analytics. Mr. Carter has requested that you come to his office at 9 a.m. this morning. He'd like to speak with you about last night's incident." "Of course," Sarah said. "I'll be there." And so it began. The unraveling of everything she'd built, the exposure of every secret she'd tried to keep buried. By the time she hung up the phone, Sarah knew her time as Sarah Mitchell was over. The only question was whether Dr. Sarah Connor would be strong enough to face Richard Carter and finally tell him the truth about what his company had done. About who she really was. About why she'd spent 6 months cleaning his house while watching him live his perfect life, apparently unburdened by the memory of an employee who'd died on his watch. She showered, dressed in the simple clothes she'd brought with her when she'd taken this job, and left the staff quarters without saying goodbye to anyone. She had 3 hours before her meeting with Richard Carter. 3 hours to decide exactly what she was going to say when she faced the man who'd indirectly killed her brother and was now, through some cosmic irony, the father of a child whose life she'd just saved. 3 hours to figure out if she was going to finally break her silence about Connor, or if she was going to walk away once again, leaving her truths unspoken and her grief unhealed. 3 hours to become the person she should have been all along. If you're still watching right now, comment. I'm still here. This story is about to take a turn no one expects. Sarah arrived at Carter Analytics headquarters at 8:55 a.m., early but not suspiciously so. The building was exactly as she remembered it from the few times she'd visited Connor here during his brief tenure with the company. Glass and steel, modern and minimalist, projecting an image of innovation and efficiency. The lobby had been renovated since she'd last been here, now featuring digital art installations that shifted and changed based on real-time data feeds, a physical manifestation of the company's AI prowess. She gave her name to the receptionist, who checked her tablet and directed her to wait in a small conference room on the executive floor. Sarah sat in an expensive ergonomic chair and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below, the traffic already thick with morning commuters, people going about their lives with no idea that in this building, 9 years ago, someone had made decisions that led to her brother's death. At exactly 9 a.m., Richard Carter walked in, and Sarah was struck by how different he looked without the armor of his wealth around him. He was wearing a suit that probably cost $5,000, but his tie was loose, his face was drawn, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept. He sat across from her, studied her for a long moment, then said, "Michael is going to be fine. He's home now, under observation by our family physician, but the hospital cleared him for discharge this morning. The doctor said if you hadn't acted as quickly as you did, if you hadn't known exactly what to do, we would have lost him." Sarah started, but Richard held up a hand. "Let me finish," he said, and his voice was tired. "I spent the night in the hospital with my son. I also spent part of that night talking to the head of security at my house, reviewing the background check we ran when we hired you. Or rather, when we thought we hired Sarah Mitchell. Except there is no Sarah Mitchell, not really. The references check out, but they belong to someone else. The previous employers exist, but they've never heard of you. Even the social security number you provided traces back to a real person, but that person died 3 years ago." Sarah felt her throat tighten but forced herself to maintain eye contact. "So I had my people do a deeper search," Richard continued. "Much deeper. And we found Dr. Sarah Connor. Medical school graduate, emergency medicine residency at Harborview. Walked away from her program 3 months before completion, no explanation given. Dropped off the grid completely about 3 years ago." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase, opened it, and Sarah saw her own face looking back at her from an old employee photo. "But that's not all we found," he said quietly. "We found her brother. Connor Mitchell. Former employee of this company. Died 9 years ago at a company retreat." And suddenly everything makes sense. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with years of grief and anger and unspoken truths. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. You want to know why I was in your house? She asked, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. You want to know why I lied, why I used a fake identity, why I spent 6 months cleaning your floors and doing your laundry? Yes, Richard said simply. I want to know. But more than that, I want to know if you came there to hurt my family. If you came there for revenge. The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized this was the moment. The moment where she could finally tell the truth she'd been carrying alone for nearly a decade. I came to your house, Sarah said, choosing her words carefully, because I needed to understand. I needed to see you as a person instead of as a name on a settlement agreement. I needed to know if you even remembered Connor, if you ever thought about what happened to him, if there was any part of you that felt responsible for his death. She took a breath, steadying herself. My brother was 26 years old. He was brilliant, kind, funny. He was going to change the world with his work here. He had his whole life ahead of him. And he died because someone in your company decided that a team-building exercise was more important than his safety. Because someone thought 18 minutes wouldn't matter. Because your company values image and efficiency more than human lives. Richard's face had gone pale, but he didn't interrupt. I signed your non-disclosure agreement, Sarah continued. I took your money because I was drowning in medical debt for my brother's final hospital bills, because I couldn't afford to fight a billion-dollar company, because I was in shock and grief and I didn't know what else to do. And then I tried to move on with my life. I tried to be a doctor, to save other people, to make Connor's death mean something by dedicating myself to emergency medicine. But she stopped, feeling the familiar weight of failure pressing down on her chest. But I couldn't do it. Every patient reminded me of him. Every time I saved someone, I thought about how I couldn't save Connor. Every time I lost someone, I thought about those 18 minutes. So I walked away from medicine. I walked away from everything. And I spent 3 years drifting, trying to figure out if there was any point to continuing when the person I loved most was gone because someone decided his life wasn't worth 18 minutes of inconvenience. Richard's hands were clasped tightly together on the table, his knuckles white. Sarah, he started, but she shook her head. I'm not finished, she said. I came to your house with no plan except to watch you. To see if you were haunted by what happened. To see if you ever thought about Connor, or if he was just another employee who died and got replaced and forgotten. I came there expecting to hate you. Expecting to find a monster who didn't care about anything except profit and success. She paused, surprised by the realization forming in her own mind even as she spoke it aloud. But instead I found a family. I found a man who works too much and misses dinner with his son. I found a woman who schedules every minute of her life because she's terrified of the chaos that comes with actually feeling things. And I found an 8-year-old boy who is lonely and scared and trying so hard to be perfect for parents who barely see him. I found, Sarah said, her voice breaking, a boy who reminded me so much of Connor that I couldn't help but care about him. And last night, when he was dying, I didn't think about revenge or justice or any of the things I'd spent years obsessing over. I just thought, not again. Not another person I care about dying while I watch. Not another family destroyed by 18 minutes of preventable tragedy. The tears came then, finally, after years of holding them back. Richard Carter sat across from her, this man she'd spent so long hating, and he looked stricken. I didn't know, he said quietly. About Connor. About the delay in calling the ambulance. About any of it. Sarah laughed, a bitter sound. Of course you didn't. That's how it works, isn't it? You build your empire, you hire people to manage the details, and when something goes wrong, there are layers and layers of corporate structure between you and the actual human cost. You never have to know. You get to keep your hands clean while people like my brother pay the price. That's not fair, Richard said, and for the first time, Sarah heard something other than measured control in his voice. She heard anger. You came into my home under false pretenses. You lied about who you were. You spent months deceiving my family. And now you're sitting here acting like you have the moral high ground? You're right, Sarah said, meeting his eyes. It's not fair. None of this is fair. It wasn't fair that Connor died. It wasn't fair that your company covered it up. It wasn't fair that I had to sign an NDA just to pay for his funeral. And it's not fair that last night, I saved your son's life because I couldn't bear to let another child die when I had the skills to prevent it. She stood up, suddenly exhausted beyond words. I'll leave. You don't have to fire me. I'll disappear, just like I did 3 years ago, and you can go back to your life and never think about me again. But before I go, I want you to know something. Richard looked up at her, his expression guarded. Your son is dying, Sarah said bluntly, and watched Richard's face go white with shock. Not the way Connor died, not in a sudden emergency. But slowly, quietly, from loneliness and neglect. From having parents who are so busy building their empire that they can't see he's struggling. From being treated like a problem to be managed instead of a child who needs love. She walked to the door, then turned back. You asked if I came to your house to hurt your family. The truth is, I don't know what I came there for. Revenge? Understanding? Closure? Maybe all of it. But what I found was a little boy who deserves better than what he's getting. A little boy who, despite everything, might actually have a chance at a real life if his parents would just pay attention. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Sarah walked out of Carter Analytics for the second time in her life. The first time, she'd been there to meet Connor for lunch, to celebrate his promotion, to tell him how proud she was of him. This time, she was leaving behind the last connection to Richard Carter and his family, and possibly the last chance she'd ever have to make her brother's death mean something. She made it to the parking garage before her phone rang. Richard Carter's name on the screen. She almost didn't answer. Almost kept walking, got in her car, and drove away to start over somewhere new. But something made her stop. Made her answer. Dr. Connor, Richard's voice was rough, like he'd been crying or shouting or both. Please don't leave. Not yet. We need to talk. Really talk. If this hooked you already, don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop a comment because what happens next will absolutely shatter your expectations. 20 minutes later, Sarah was back in that conference room, but this time Eleanor Carter was there too, her makeup imperfect for perhaps the first time since Sarah had known her, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped a coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I told Eleanor everything, Richard said without preamble. About Connor. About what you told me. About why you came to work for us. Eleanor's eyes were red-rimmed, and when she looked at Sarah, there was something raw and vulnerable in her expression. I didn't know, Eleanor said quietly. About your brother. About what happened at that retreat. Richard handles the company, I handle our home and our social obligations, and we both thought that was working. We thought we had everything under control. You don't, Sarah said bluntly. Your son almost died last night because somewhere in all your careful organization, nobody noticed his EpiPen needed to be replaced. Because you're so used to delegating everything to other people that you've lost track of what actually matters. I know, Eleanor said, and her voice broke. When I saw you carrying him, when I saw his lips turning blue, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd actually held him. Actually hugged him. Not just patted his head as I walked by or kissed his forehead while he was sleeping. Really held him. She wiped at her eyes with fingers that trembled. I've been so focused on making sure everything looked perfect. Making sure we attended the right events, knew the right people, that Michael went to the right school and had the right tutors and the right opportunities. And I completely missed the fact that what he actually needed was his mother. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a slight loosening of the tight knot of anger and grief she'd carried for so long. What do you want from me? She asked. Why did you ask me to come back? We want, Richard said, then corrected himself. I want to make things right. With you. With Connor's memory. With my son. I can't change what happened 9 years ago. I can't bring your brother back. But I can make sure his death wasn't meaningless. He pulled out a document from his briefcase, several pages of legal text that Sarah recognized as a contract of some kind. I've been working on this all morning with our legal team, he said. It's a proposal. First, we void the NDA you signed. Completely. You're free to talk about Connor, about what happened, about anything related to his death. No restrictions, no consequences. Second, we're launching an investigation into the circumstances of his death. A real investigation, not the whitewash we did 9 years ago. And whatever we find, we make public. Third, we're creating a safety protocol in Connor's name. Every employee, every event, every situation where allergies or medical conditions could be a factor. We're going to make sure what happened to Connor never happens to anyone else. He pushed the document across the table. And fourth, we want to hire you. Not as a maid. As our Director of Health and Safety. You'd report directly to me, you'd have the authority to implement any changes you think are necessary, and you'd be responsible for making sure this company values human lives over convenience or profit. Sarah stared at the document, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. You want to hire me? After everything I just told you? After I lied to you for 6 months? Because you lied for 6 months, Richard said. Because you cared enough about your brother to spend 6 months in a job you were overqualified for just to understand what happened to him. Because when my son was dying, you didn't think about your grief or your anger. You just saved his life. That's the person I want working for me. That's the person this company should have valued 9 years ago. Sarah picked up the contract, scanned through the legal language, and felt tears burning behind her eyes again. There was a number at the bottom, the proposed salary. It was more than she would have made as a doctor. It was the kind of money that could change someone's life. But there's something else, Eleanor said quietly. Michael has been asking for you. He doesn't remember much from last night, but he remembers feeling safe because you were there. He trusts you. She took a shaky breath. We'd like you to be part of his life. Not as a housekeeper. As someone who actually sees him, who pays attention to him, who can teach him that adults can be trusted to keep him safe. Sarah thought about Michael, about his shy smile and his dinosaur collection and the way he'd held her hand in the ambulance. She thought about Connor, about the promise she'd made to herself that his death would mean something. And she thought about the doctor she'd been training to become, the person who'd dedicated her life to saving others, the version of herself she'd walked away from because the pain had been too great. I need to know something first, she said, looking between Richard and Eleanor. "If I take this job, if I accept this offer, I need to know you're serious about changing. Not just implementing new protocols or throwing money at the problem. Actually changing how you think about the people who work for you. About valuing human beings over profits. Can you do that?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, honestly, "I don't know. I've spent 20 years building this company. I've made decisions that prioritized growth over everything else. I've probably failed hundreds of people in ways I'm not even aware of." He looked at Sarah with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, humility. "But I want to try. I want to be better. I want my son to grow up knowing his father did something meaningful with his power instead of just accumulating more of it. And I want Connor's death to be the catalyst that changes this company into something he would have been proud to work for." Sarah looked down at the contract again, at all those legal words that represented a second chance. Not just for her, but for Richard, for Eleanor, for Michael, for every employee at Carter Analytics who might otherwise become another tragic accident that got swept under corporate carpet. She thought about the doctor she'd been training to become. The healer. The person who ran toward emergencies instead of away from them. The person who believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, that people could be saved. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, I'll do it. But on one condition." "Name it," Richard said immediately. "We established the Connor Mitchell Memorial Fund," Sarah said. "Not just a scholarship. A fund that supports employees and their families when they face medical emergencies. A fund that pays for funeral expenses, for medical bills, for the things that insurance doesn't cover. A fund that says this company remembers the people it's lost and honors them by taking care of the people who remain." "Done," Richard said without hesitation. "We'll announce it at the company meeting next month." She picked up the pen he offered her and signed her real name for the first time in 6 months. Dr. Sarah Connor. Not the broken woman who'd walked away from medicine. Not the grief-stricken sister who'd lost her way. The person she was meant to be all along. If you're still here, subscribe, because stories like this only work when people stay. 6 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in early spring, Sarah sat in the backyard of the Carter estate watching Michael chase butterflies through the garden. He'd grown 3 inches, gained weight, and lost the haunted look that had been in his eyes when she'd first started working there. Eleanor was sitting beside her on the patio, for once not checking her phone or running off to another appointment. She'd cut back her schedule dramatically, started having dinner with Michael every night, started showing up for his school events instead of sending the nanny. Richard was inside, but Sarah could hear him through the open window, on a video call with the leadership team, discussing the new employee wellness protocols they were implementing across all departments. The Connor Mitchell Memorial Fund had raised over $2 million in its first month, with matching contributions from the company and voluntary donations from employees who were grateful someone finally cared about their well-being. The investigation into Connor's death had been published, revealing the full extent of the negligence and the cover-up that had followed. 3 executives had been fired. The company had issued a public apology. And while nothing could bring Connor back, Sarah felt like his death finally meant something. But the real change, the one that mattered most to her, was sitting right here in this garden. Michael ran up to her, breathless and grinning, holding out a monarch butterfly that had landed on his finger. "Look, Sarah," he said, his eyes bright with wonder. "Isn't it beautiful?" "It is," Sarah agreed, and she felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in years, peace. Because this boy was alive. This boy was happy. This boy would grow up knowing that his life mattered, that people would run toward him in emergencies instead of away, that the adults in his world valued him more than they valued their image or their profit margins. Michael ran off again, and Eleanor turned to Sarah with a soft smile. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "For saving him. For saving all of us, really." Sarah thought about all the roads that had led her here. The grief that had nearly destroyed her. The lies she'd told. The anger she'd carried. The moment when she'd had to choose between her pain and a child's life, and how that choice had somehow healed something in her she'd thought was broken forever. "I didn't save you," Sarah said gently. "You saved yourselves. I just showed you what was at stake if you didn't." She watched Michael laughing in the sunshine, watched Richard step outside to join them, watched this family that had been fractured and frozen begin to thaw and reconnect. And she thought about Connor, about the brother she'd lost, about the promise she'd made to make his death mean something. Maybe, she thought, this was it. Not revenge. Not justice, exactly. But transformation. A family changed. A company changed. A woman who'd walked away from healing learning to heal herself by helping others. And a little boy who would grow up never knowing how close he'd come to being another statistic, another tragic accident, another life lost to the kind of negligence that values convenience over care. Michael called out to her, asking her to come see something he'd found, and Sarah stood up, brushed off her jeans, and walked toward him. Not as a maid. Not as an imposter. But as Dr. Sarah Connor, the person she'd always been meant to be, doing the work she'd always been meant to do, in a way she never could have imagined. Behind her, Eleanor and Richard exchanged a look, one of those silent conversations that couples have when words aren't necessary. They'd been given a second chance. All of them had. And this time, they weren't going to waste it. "Now I want to hear from you, because this story raises questions that don't have easy answers. What would you do if you discovered that someone in your home had been lying about who they were for months? Would you be able to forgive them if their reasons came from a place of pain? And what about Sarah's choice to use a fake identity to get close to the family? Was that justified by her grief, or did she cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed? Think about Richard and Eleanor, too. They lost sight of what mattered while chasing success and perfection. How many of us do the same thing in smaller ways? How many of us are so busy trying to make everything look right that we forget to actually be present for the people who need us? And here's the hardest question: if you were in Sarah's position, if someone's negligence had cost you a person you loved, could you find it in yourself to save their child's life? Could you put aside your anger and your grief in that moment of crisis and do what needed to be done? This story shows us that people are complicated. That pain can drive us to make choices we never imagined we'd make. That sometimes the person we think is our enemy is just another broken human trying to figure out how to live with their mistakes. That healing doesn't always look like justice, but it might look like transformation. Sarah went into that house wanting to understand why her brother died. She left having saved a life, changed a company, and found a way back to the person she'd lost when Connor died. That's not the ending she expected. It's not the ending any of them expected. But maybe it's the ending they all needed. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own relationships and priorities, if it reminded you that the people we overlook might be carrying stories we can't imagine, then share it. Click that like button. Drop a comment telling me what you thought. Tell me if you think Sarah did the right thing. Tell me if you believe people like Richard and Eleanor can really change. And make sure you're subscribed, because next week, I'm bringing you another true story that will challenge everything you think you know about forgiveness, about family, and about the prices we pay for the choices we make. Until then, take care of each other. Pay attention to the people around you. And remember that everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about. Sometimes the person cleaning your house is a doctor. Sometimes the person serving your coffee is carrying grief you can't imagine. Sometimes the people we dismiss as invisible are the ones with the power to save us. My mom said I can't hit 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Subscribe and let's prove her wrong. Let's build a community of people who believe these stories matter, who believe that truth is stranger and more powerful than any fiction we could create. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being part of this journey.